I knew that they kind of saw somebody from the United States is hitting our servers a ton, and they're hitting a bunch of topics about like Chinese rom-coms and soap operas and also communism and politics.
They're like, why does this guy care about this rom-com so much? Like,
Yeah,
what's his
yeah.
investment here? Hey everyone, welcome back to the Security Engineering Show, the best show for security engineers by security engineers. I'm your host, Noah Stanford, joined today by Mitch Edwards, CEO of GrabbrApp, who previously did threat intelligence at SentinelOne and CrowdStrike. Our episode today is Hacking the Great Firewall, which is about work Mitch did in university while studying security and Mandarin. He was aware of China's widespread censorship and set out to learn more. By establishing a campaign on a Chinese Yahoo Answers equivalent, he was able to see modifications and deletions of sensitive topics. Thanks for joining me today, Mitch.
Yeah, super excited. I've listened to the last several episodes of the podcast and really enjoyed it.
I really appreciate that. So I guess to jump a little bit into this today, tell me a bit about like how did you get into this at first? What was the segue into I want to do this OS Inc. campaign?
Most of my career has been mainly on accident, kind of be stumbling into cool and interesting things. When I was in high school, I had already taught myself how to code and had a bunch of friends who supported me through that. So I knew that when I went to college, I wanted to do computer science, and my parents were awesome and recommended that I do something on top of that. So they said, learn a foreign language, thinking that I was going to do Spanish or French or like something like that. And I was like, okay, let's look into this. And the university that I was going to, University of Mississippi, they had a intensive Chinese program that was still fairly new. There was a big, long application process, and I ended up getting in. And I told my parents, like, the day it happened, I was like, hey, so I'm going to be going abroad. For kind of context, I grew up in Mississippi and had never been on a plane before until I got on a plane to go to Shanghai, China for like a full 3 months. And They were like taken aback, but I knew there's probably going to be some value in learning Chinese and doing computer science. I hadn't even really thought about security at that point. But fast forward a year, I had done about roughly a year and a half of language studies at that point and went overseas and was like a couple blocks down from the building where the OPM hack supposedly happened from. So I was in Shanghai when all of that went down. That was eye-opening. I was like, okay, there might be something to learning Mandarin and maybe doing security. I didn't know anything about threat intelligence. I didn't know anything about the field in general, but when I got home, I dove into it. A couple years later, I was about to graduate, and I knew that I wanted to do something that involved both of my kind of passions at that time in Mandarin and in computer science as my senior project. And I'm not to get like political, obviously, but I'm staunchly anti-censorship on the majority of issues and was like, let's look into this. I had brushes with it over the couple of years that I'd been studying Mandarin. We had to use a couple of online platforms that were based out of China. And every time we used them, we ran against some sort of censorship. Either we weren't allowed to post things just to begin with, or they were deleted. So that's kind of where the idea was born.
It's actually kind of funny because, I spent some time on the Gulf Coast, and there's not a big Chinese community nor a large information security community there. So it's definitely interesting to see the mix, and I think that resonates with a lot of folks that come from that area. I never took a flight until I was about 20, so it's an area where most folks don't travel, but you got into an extremely technical area and then went straight overseas. So super interesting to, I guess, see that dichotomy.
Yeah, for sure.
After you had ran against this a few times in your own experience of posting things, watching them be modified or deleted, what was kind of the next step? What led you to where you went with creating an application or a program, I'd say, to do this?
Throughout the studying process, we posted a lot of different things on these different message boards in Chinese as like a way of kind of practicing the language. We were basically pretending to be Chinese on a lot of these message boards and talking to folks. And we would get very weird reactions, just like, hey, I'll answer your question, but your grammar is really weird. And it's like, well, that's because our grammar is bad. So that was a fun experience. But we noticed our professors told us, hey, don't post anything political. It's just not a really good idea. Your account might get banned. They were all for the most part, I believe, American citizens who had grown up in China. So it wasn't really like they didn't have any political reasoning for telling us not to get political on the message boards. It was more like a logistical thing. Like, hey, if your account gets banned, then you can't practice your Chinese on this site anymore, which is kind of a pain. But we noticed even non-political topics, we would post something and it would disappear. And we might get a message saying, hey, you talked about a banned subject. And we weren't talking about anything controversial, but that in my brain tickled this spot that whenever it gets curious, I know that I've got to build something. And that was right around my senior year. So I was like, well, let's dive into this. I knew that this was a problem that could be automated. We were using a site called Zhihu, which is kind of like Yahoo Answers mixed with like Twitter or Facebook. It's a really social platform that's built around question and answer type discussions. But I was like, let's go ahead and start with this platform. I'll spin up a non-attributable account. So if it gets banned, it gets banned. And let's start just scraping stuff. It started with Python because that was what I was learning at the time. Not the best tool for the job, but that's what I was learning at the time. And
performance is irrelevant. Output is what matters, right?
And when you're a senior in college, you know everything, and you know that Python is the best language for literally anything, and that's just the truth of the matter. Luckily, I've grown since then, but that's when I built this web scraper in Python and started just pulling stuff down, and the rest was a cat and mouse game with Chinese censors, which was fun.
So what sort of stuff did you guys start scraping, and what did you do with the data?
So my goal was, let's take topics that I'm fairly certain are going to be censored. Let's take topics that I'm fairly certain aren't going to be censored. And let's take a smattering of other topics. So it was all divided kind of like Reddit is into different topics. So you had one for Chinese state communism. You had one for specific like rom-coms that are in Chinese that are really popular. You have one for soap operas in Chinese that are really popular. So it really just ran the gamut of different discussion topics. And I just said, well, let's scrape a lot of them. I built out possibly the least efficient iteration of a web scraper possible. And I was just pulling them down with basically a wait period in between each request. And I was archiving the content and checking to see if it was still there later on.
Right. Or changed.
Or changed. The changes, I really thought I was going to see more of that because in my mind, there's some guy sitting behind everybody with a keyboard saying, hey, you need to change that word, or, sending a message. That I don't think I ever saw any instance of that. It was mainly just flat out deletion.
It reminds me of the South Park leaning over the shoulder and erasing what he wrote along the way. Yeah.
Bingo. That's in my brain. That's what was happening. And it was definitely not.
Let's say you guys have deployed this. You've got some amount of topics you guys are looking at. How much data are you guys getting, and what are you doing with that postmortem, or what are you seeing in the data?
In my brain, it was a ton of data. As a senior in college who has never seen any amount of like quote unquote big data, I was doing the biggest of data. It was like a gigabyte a day or something silly like that. And the scraper would go down all the time because A, I was building it in Python, and B, I wasn't building it well. So the scraper would fall over. I remember there was one time I was at work. I was working security at a bar, and it was luckily a slow night, so I brought my laptop. And I checked to see if the scraper was down, and it had fallen over like an hour before.
Yeah.
So I yanked my laptop out, and I'm sitting there with a terminal open, and there's a bunch of drunk college students behind me like, hey, what are you doing? And I'm like, don't worry about it.
Yeah, right. Monitoring Chinese censorship, right?
Yeah, you don't
the unexpected answer.
Cool, buy me some shots.
It's interesting too, but because with this type of tool, you'd imagine it would have some breakage via things like Quick, like HTTPS over UDP or HTTP2, just not supporting it, right? I've definitely seen that in the past with these sort of like either scrapers or intermediary proxies. Once you have the data, how are you aggregating this so you can actually do something actionable with it? And then what are your thoughts?
So I thought I was the smartest kid in the world. Stored all of the data in flat text JSON, just sitting on my laptop. Again, I just thought I was brilliant. I was like, I'm not going to use any databases.
I promise the latency is much lower than whatever cloud service people would suggest in comparison.
The I/O was not the problem there. It was definitely everything else that I designed around it. But basically, it was storing all of the data by topic. And every couple minutes, I think it was like every 5 minutes, something like that, it would run through each topic and each post that it had pulled down from that topic and check to see if it was still there. It was fairly simple like that. And the findings, which we can talk about whenever, were basically straightforward in that there was not as much ham-fisted censorship going on as you would think. One of the problems with my research, for example, is that it checked to see if the post was still there, but there was no way to tell if the user just took down the post because it was a dumb post, or if they were getting brigaded, or if somebody else took it down. So it was flawed research, but it was interesting at least.
Yeah, right. Especially if you see some sort of outsized amount of removals, then you might see something more likely to correlate with an actual trend. Did you see any trends like that along the way?
The trends that I was expecting was, anything relating to Taiwan or Hong Kong, which this is well before Hong Kong got quote unquote reunified, and kind of when things were kicking off with Taiwan, one of the many times they have. And I was expecting those topics to get censored. I was expecting any discussion of freedom or democracy to get censored. The thing that was the most censored was a social issue. At the time, China was going through their version of Me Too, which was a couple years, I believe, after it kind of swept the US and the West by storm. Basically, there was a very significant sexual abuse scandal that broke at a major Chinese university that led to one of the students committing suicide. It was an incredibly sad story. We were all following it anyways throughout class. And what I noted was there were very few posts that I picked up as being censored before that point. And then the vast majority of the posts that I picked up being censored after that point were related to this Chinese Me Too movement or about sexual abuse scandals. And that made me realize, well, let's look into kind of the political side of this. What has China pushed the most against? It's always been social movements because those have the most potential to get people riled up enough to get out into the streets. You saw it with Me Too here. People were getting really angry and were actually mobilizing. Right. So in China, it was the same thing. That's why they pushed back against it so much.
And I think when we previously talked about this, you told me about, I think it may have been a group or either a campaign called Wu Mao. Tell me a little bit about that.
It's real, and it's also a bit of a meme, but Wu Mao is the Chinese word for 5 cents, and they're called the Wu Mao Army, which is the 5 cent army. And the idea is that at a certain point in time, censors or folks who had a media following were paid per post or paid per article that they would put out. And the rumor was that they were paid 5 cents or Wu Mao to put out different articles. That has since, in the digital age, transformed into large-scale harassment campaigns that are very clearly either automated or very coordinated by somebody else. You'd see it on Twitter fairly frequently, where all of a sudden somebody would be talking about something sensitive and then their post would get just completely brigaded by folks speaking Chinese, broken English, having Chinese, things like that. Then you would have the folks who would just post things that are overall positive towards the Chinese political class, and they would be kind of part of that same Wu Mao movement. So one of my larger regrets for this research was that I wasn't tracking stuff like that. I wasn't tracking posts that were sensitive that stayed up, but it had a ton of comments beneath it that were either harassing or overall negative.
Sentiment against
that would have been really great.
The post, right?
Yeah.
So as you were scraping this data, and it's interesting that was the finding that came out of this, because I imagine some of the topics you mentioned are democracy and other things would have been my hot button issues I would expect to be censored, but it more social issues, the things inside of China and the State of Union is more of what they were worried about. And it sounds like along the way they kind of try to fight you on actually being able to scrape this site. Talk to me about what they started doing to prevent you from actually getting this data. It sounds like you got spotted along the way.
Yeah, it's funny. The time that I mentioned when the scraper went down while I was working at the bar, it was an instance of China changing the structure of the HTML pages that I was scraping. So this might be getting slightly into the weeds, but I was using
by all
Python.
Means, please do.
Okay,
yeah.
Good, fantastic. I was using Python, HTTP requests, or the request library, and Beautiful Soup. Beautiful Soup is kind of the go-to for HTML parsing. It makes it really, really easy to target the structure of HTML so that you can pull
classes, IDs.
Right.
Yeah.
It makes it very easy to pull out information from web pages, which I really much big time appreciated because I did not want to touch regexes or anything else. I wanted to do it the easy way. So several times while I was doing the scraping project, my scraper would go down and it would say it was because of a parsing error. Something like this element doesn't exist. You're trying to read from an element that doesn't exist, something like that. And for a bit, I kind of marked that off as like, okay, it's probably because I'm writing bad code. Like that checks. But then I started looking back at it, and I had archived several HTML pages, and I started noticing that class names were changing, or IDs were changing, or very few times, but a couple of times, the overall structure of the HTML was changing in such a way that it broke my scraper, which was incredibly irritating because that's a difficult bug to fix. Overall, it taught me a lot about targeting the structure of HTML. If you target in such a way that in order to change the HTML in a way that breaks it, you would have to change the overall way the page looks, and it might like actually break your web page or make it look ugly. That's when that stuff stopped. When I abstracted it out to where I was focused more on the structure and less on the IDs and class names and things like that, those changes stopped. Then I was getting IP banned. That's my solution to that.
The ultimate solution of get off of our website. Don't come back.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, super easy. My end solution to that was I found some wonderful soul who was posting open HTTP proxies on Pastebin, and the link to the Pastebin was fairly guessable. So I just scraped the raw data from Pastebin and pulled down those HTTP proxies. And I basically had a function that would randomly pick one of the HTTP proxies from that Pastebin list, and that worked for ages. Like they could not stop that for a long time, which I was very thankful for.
I previously come from a background in game servers, so think Minecraft and other type of servers. And it's interesting because when people attack the like layer 7 protocol, like let's say the login protocol for some sort of MMO game, they very often don't have some sort of novel exploit. They're just doing things like pumping zeros into the MAC address. And it's interesting because it's very easy to block in one case, but assuming they abandon that and start doing the flood on a more widespread scale from separate hops, ideally it becomes a lot harder for you to actually categorize the traffic.
Right. And this is a large site. We're talking like millions of visitors. So I really didn't expect, because I was running the scraper so slowly. I mean, it was like 1 or 2 requests a minute or something like that at a certain point. As kind of an aside, and this might be telling on myself, I ended up cranking it up to like 1 every 10 seconds just because I got angry. So towards the end of my senior project, I was like, well, I'm going to get banned either way. So I'm just going to go ahead and just blow it up and see how much data I can get. So if I was scraping a gigabyte a day, I think I upped it to like 2 or 3. Wasn't significant. But basically, I approached it from a layered approach at a certain point. I was like, I'm running into these issues with HTML. Here are 4 different ways that I know that they've changed the HTML before, and I'm just going to do like a try-catch on all of them. And that worked for a while. Then I added the IP kind of like bounce layer, and let's try 3 or 4 different IPs before you shut down the program. Then the CAPTCHAs were a problem, but they didn't want to put CAPTCHAs too frequently because they'd make their own users
annoy
mad.
Users, right?
Right. So I just slowed down the requests if I ran into a CAPTCHA. So I run into a CAPTCHA, I'm like, okay, instead of once every 10 seconds, I'll run the request once every 30 seconds for like a minute or 2. And then I could go back to blasting it every couple seconds. So it was a pretty significant cat and mouse game for a while. They also started hitting my user agent, so I started having to cycle through user agents. I got to a point where I knew that they were watching and they were curious what I was doing. I am not silly enough to think that they ever read my research. I honestly hope they didn't because the paper is so bad, but I knew that they kind of saw somebody from the United States is hitting our servers a ton, and they're hitting a bunch of topics about like Chinese rom-coms and soap operas and also communism and politics. So we don't know what this is.
It's ironic because I can't imagine like today, as speaking from like a blue team perspective, we're on the side and we're like, what are they trying to do? Oh, they're trying to get financial data. Oh, they're trying to pop domain admin for the DC. They're like, why does this guy care about this rom-com so much? What's his investment here?
It must have really sketched them out for a bit. And now you've got a bunch of IP wars over, okay, well, Twitter's implemented these new, very unpopular API design choices so that people don't scrape their data and toss it into an LLM. But this was before all of that. They were probably not worried about somebody spinning up a clone of Zhihu, but they were at least curious as to why somebody's scraping a fairly decent amount of data from their servers.
It's actually ironic from a red team perspective to think about 2 things. A, how the defense is going to react to you, but especially B, if you're attacking a platform that has some sort of wide scale they not only have the challenge of implementing security, they have to implement security at a scale that does not disrupt normal user behavior. And that can be a lot harder than adding a captcha to every page where your 700 people may get over it. But if you have 100,000 users, what's your churn at that point?
Yeah, and the fun part is like with scraping, the thing that I learned is that there's functionally no way to actually stop it. I went back to this project a little while later in a different iteration. I started scraping like dark web forums for one of my jobs. And I decided, okay, well, Python's probably not going to do it. The way that I was doing it in general isn't going to do it. Let's try it a different way. And I built a JavaScript browser plugin that I tossed into Chrome. And all it did was scroll down the page and yank everything out using jQuery. And
Right.
it yanked everything out, threw it in an actual database this time. I grew a lot in between my senior project and this project. But the reason why that's difficult, at least to stop, is that for the most part, it is just doing the same thing a user would do a little bit faster. And in order to detect that, you've got to start looking at a lot of different metrics, like, okay, how fast are they scrolling? How many posts are they viewing? When you have to do that across a million users, probably not. Twitter kind of stopped bots, but if you register for an account, I'm not going to get into how you could do it because that might get you in trouble, but there are many different ways that you could pull that off in a way
Right.
that it's very, very difficult to stop, especially at scale.
You had talked before about how this sort of work with like learning about scraping, threat intelligence, or intelligence in general led you into the field of threat intel. So could you talk a little bit about that and your foray into the dark web?
Yeah, foray into the dark web. That sounds a lot
It's
cooler than
such
what
a,
it ends up being.
I was about to say, it's such a bad sentence because there are all these YouTube videos like, I went to the dark web and you won't believe what I found. But like, realistically, I think the thing I would push to viewers is it's not so much the sketchiest place on the internet as it is somewhere harder to push attribution to the people actually pushing out the contents, and then a free market for you to push out contents of whatever you'd like. So especially for information, it can be a very public market where it's hard to attribute data to the actual person who may have stolen it in the first place.
Yeah, it makes attribution harder for sure, but it's from somebody who's been on it more often than I would like, it's really boring. Like most of the stuff on there is just super boring, or it's like stuff that you're not really all that interested in. Like for one of my jobs, it was fairly dark web heavy, and it was just constantly, we need you to find actionable intelligence on these Chinese like dark web forums. And we'd go on there and it's just like people talking about football, or they're like selling cards, which we weren't all that interested in. Like there's not much that you can do with like, hey, there's somebody selling a bunch of card data. Occasionally you'd find somebody who would be talking about malware, but then you'd have to buy it, and there's this whole legal thing behind that. So basically what ended up happening is I graduated my senior year and had this background in Chinese, and I was thinking about going federal, but at that time it was right after Snowden and OPM, basically like back to back. So getting a clearance was like just about impossible at that point in time. They were taking forever for it. So that's basically why I ended up going the private sector route. And I started working for a company called Intel 471, and I was an analyst there writing basically threat intelligence reporting based off of what other folks were finding on deep web forums. So I would kind of write things up as a quote unquote subject matter expert about whatever was going on at the time. It was mostly carding forums and stuff like that. But after that, I moved on to CrowdStrike, did fairly similar work there, lots of writing, mainly about Chinese stuff. And I was there for 2 years doing threat intel work on mainly either dark web forums or forums that aren't accessible by folks who
Right.
don't speak Chinese.
And I think Sentinel-1 as well, right? Talk me through, like, after going through, especially a lot of these major EDR vendors, and I think CrowdStrike's an interesting example because if you've ever been to, like, a security conference, CrowdStrike has these massive, like, monoliths of, like, this is the threat actor, like, Venom Spider. What was your experience seeing all of that data on the back end at both of these, like, major EDR vendors?
So at CrowdStrike, I wasn't in front of the EDR data, which I was at Sentinel-1, and I noted very quickly what the difference is when you actually have the data in front of you. But at CrowdStrike, I was on the threat intel side, so I was mainly writing up reporting. My team was on the collection side, so we would pull stuff down from a lot of the sites and do research on, my main focus was the People's Liberation Army at the time. So I was doing a lot of research on how that whole structure worked. And staying away from the data kind of stunk in hindsight. I didn't realize it at the time. I was really interested in a lot of the work that I was doing, and frankly, I would still do a lot of that work if I had the time. But when you don't have access to the data and you're writing up reporting based on what you're seeing online and what kind of research you're doing, it's not super actionable. And that's not like shots against the threat intelligence industry as a whole, because there is a way to make stuff more actionable.
Right.
But when you're going to your SOC team lead and you're like, hey, the PLA just underwent like this major restructuring into the SSF, and now all of cyber is going to change coming out of China. They're like, okay, cool. What do we block? Like, give me the malware, give me the hashes, give me the IOCs, give me something on attack, like anything. Give me something.
We're not there yet,
I
right?
can't do anything. Yeah. So there's kind of like what SOC needs or what IR needs over here. And then way over there, you've got a lot of the threat intel reporting that's coming out. And there are exceptions to this. I worked on some stuff that was a lot closer to, what the SOC and IR team needed whenever I was able to find malware. But for the most part, a lot of the threat intelligence stuff that's coming out of the deep, dark, dank web is not like hyper useful. Like, you can't do much with it.
The deep, dark, dank web, the DDW.
Yeah, that's trademarked,
that's my new go-to for it. Yeah. I'll happily pay the 10 or 15 cents every time I need to use that. I'll use it really often. Expect checks.
Perfect.
Well, thanks again for the time today, Matt. It's been awesome talking about this. I think it's been extremely interesting just going from this initial curiosity of what's going on this website. Can I detect mainland Chinese censorship, to actually see it happen in real time and watch the end web service try to adapt to accommodate your scraping. It was extremely interesting to see.
Yeah, it was a cool trip down memory lane. I haven't worked on that research in like 6 years, so it was cool to look back on it.